And good afternoon or good morning wherever you are, and welcome to the QEM Heroes webinar series. I'm Christine Wood, and I serve as the Assistant Program Director for the Heroes Fellows Program at QEM. And for more than 30 years, QEM has been a national catalyst for STEM education transformation and research capacity building. Currently, the QEM network serves nearly 900 colleges and universities and reaches more than 8,000 individuals nationwide. This webinar is part of the HEROES initiative. The HEROES program brings together researchers with experience in the federal government to lend their expertise and support to the STEM research and education communities. Our fellows are here to provide tools and tips for navigating the funding landscape, developing STEM programs and partnerships, and improving talent retention in in-demand fields. We hope this series promotes engagement with our HEROES fellows and provides valuable resources to our participants. The webinar recordings and slides will be available in the QEM Resource Hub. By attending this webinar, you will soon be added to the QEM network and granted access to the Resource Hub. And I'm so proud to introduce our Heroes Fellows today. Dr. Toni Danstedt uses her PhD in systems science and developmental psychology to advance equitable, informal STEM learning research and practice. Toni's led over 100 research and evaluation studies in collaboration with practitioners, academics, artists, and community members. Her work has explored the impacts of informal learning for people of all ages and has spanned topics including social justice, metacognition, spatial reasoning, and environmental and social science. With deep applied research methods and design expertise, Toni has experience as a primary investigator and lead researcher, an evaluation consultant, and a program officer for STEM education funding programs. Dr. Toya Frank is a mathematics educator, researcher, and STEM education leader with a passion for creating just and equitable learning opportunities. She recently served as a program director at the National Science Foundation, where she led national initiatives in racial equity in STEM education and data science core. She also served at George Mason University as an associate professor of mathematics education leadership and secondary education. As a published author and sought-after keynote speaker, Dr. Frank has shared her expertise with organizations such as the Association of Mathematics Teachers Educators, the National Council of Teachers of Mathematics, and the Psychology of Mathematics Education, North America. Beyond her scholarship, she collaborates with teachers, leaders, and mathematicians across the U.S. and abroad. And Dr. Naomi Hall Byers is a social psychologist whose work examines social, cultural, and contextual factors that drive health and educational inequities among historically marginalized groups. For 16 years, she was a professor of psychological sciences at Winston-Salem State University, where she directed the Race, Culture, and Context Lab. She previously served as a program director and acting deputy division director in the Social and Economic Sciences Division of the Directorate for Social Behavior and Economic Sciences at the National Science Foundation. Dr. Hall Byers holds a PhD in applied social psychology and an MPH in maternal and child health, with expertise in social and behavioral sciences, mixed methods, and evaluation. And last but not least, Dr. Tori Rulak-Smith is an educator whose career spans more than 2 decades in higher education and government. As a faculty member and director of undergraduate studies in what was formerly the College of Engineering, Architecture, and Computer Sciences at Howard University, she guided students and faculty in teaching and learning, advising, research, recruitment, and corporate engagement. In government, Tori was lead program director for the National Science Foundation's Eddie Bernice Johnson Includes initiative and program director for the Historically Black Colleges and Universities undergraduate program and the Faculty Early Career Development program. Her efforts focused on providing funding and support for undergraduate research, education, and large collaborative networks implementing systems-focused strategies that broaden participation in STEM. Tori is an engineer by training, with a Bachelor of Science degree in Civil Engineering from Howard University and a Master of Science and Doctor of Philosophy degrees in Civil Engineering from North Carolina State University. And I'm so happy to turn the floor over to our presenters today.
Thank you, Christine. We are going to share our presentation here and get started. All right, maybe just a quick thumbs up to make sure everyone is seeing the right thing. Perfect. All right, thank you very much. Well, I am excited to be here with you all today, along with my esteemed colleagues, to talk with you about establishing a solid foundation for your research. We're going to look at sort of the whys and hows of literature reviews. And this is incredibly important because we all know the necessity for critical analysis and synthesis of extant scholarship and literature in research. We are looking at sort of what research already exists and what findings exist that will help you frame and support your research. And so that's where we are going to focus today. This, of course, is a topic that is generally applicable across research proposals and empirical studies, regardless of discipline. But our focus for today, as part of a webinar series, is really on STEM education and behavioral science applications. You might ask or wonder why reviews is in parentheses in the title, or in parentheses in the title. And that really is to make the distinction between the literature review section that might be part of a proposal or a paper, and the idea of reviewing and applying literature throughout a proposal. So we did that intentionally because today's webinar is going to provide helpful information on both topics. We'll talk about literature reviews as a specific section of a research document, and also the review and application of literature throughout a proposal. So with that, let's look at some of the specific topics for today. When you think about the whys of making good use of literature in research, we are going to focus on literature as a way of grounding and situating your work, common mistakes to avoid, and also using literature to guide research design. When you think about the hows, our primary focus will be sort of searching, assessing, tracking, and synthesizing literature. We'll also talk about some efficiency techniques and then strategies for proposal writing specifically. So before we dive into content, we want to start off with a poll just to get a sense of how those of you in the audience approach literature reviews. So Christine, if you'll help us launch that poll, we're going to ask you to select all that apply to this question. What do you typically include in a literature review for your research? There are quite a few options here. You can check as many as apply. And if there is something that comes to mind that's not included here, feel free to just check the other box, and you're welcome to add what those other elements are in the chat. We'll give it just a moment so that you all can respond. All right, I know we've added quite a list here. It might take some time just to read through all the options, but hopefully you all are getting a sense of what's there and helping to provide us with a sense of what's sort of the standard operating procedure for you as it relates to literature review. Christine, do we have a critical mass, perhaps?
We do, and I'll end the poll right now.
Perfect. All right. So let's see here. All right. Okay, we have a pretty good mix amongst the available options. Certainly, most have said that they provide an overview of main points from similar studies, wanting to point out gaps in research and explanation of theoretical frameworks. Those seem to be sort of the top answers, but then also providing a basis for research methods, summarizing by theme, sort of using subheadings to organize that, the interpretations of other researchers' work, or what might be perceived as weaknesses or strengths of the sources that were used. All do some combination of these. So let's dive in more and just talk about what this looks like in the general context of research. Technically, there's no right or wrong answer to this question. It was a bit of a trick question because it's all about how you approach your literature review, how you operationalize these different concepts. I will say, having been a program director at the National Science Foundation, there are certainly proposals that included every single one of these aspects in a single literature review section. And then there were others that incorporated the aspects, but at various points throughout the proposal. So again, we just want to make the distinction that as we move forward, when we say literature review, we're referring to that sort of specific chapter of a thesis or dissertation or research document more broadly that's used to identify what's known, where there are gaps, and really make the case for why a proposed course of study or course of action is needed. When we say review of literature, not to be confused with literature review, we're talking about that broader application throughout a proposal or throughout a study to identify and explain the rationale for your methods and interpretation of findings and similar things. So let us move forward with a quote. It looks like, all right, it brought both of them up at the same time. So, why is this important? Really, literature strengthens proposals and helps to increase their competitiveness. And this quote from the William T. Grant Foundation really captured that well. Let's see. Sorry, my computer decided to do something weird at just that moment. But this is an opportunity provided by the W.T. Grant Foundation specific to research grants on improving the use of research evidence. I will note that if you're interested, this is an opportunity that will open this summer on June 3rd with proposals due on July 29th. So it's something that you might want to look into. But what was most compelling about this opportunity was a quote that is included on the program page that simply says, one of the most common issues in letters of inquiry is a lack of sufficient grounding in the existing empirical literature. And in the case of this program, that would be literature on the use of research evidence. We strongly encourage applicants to review the resources for applicants, which comprise foundational texts on the use of research evidence, as well as historical and more recent work by grantees. So there is a link here where the W.T. Grant Foundation is actually providing links to related literature and useful resources that you might consider. So we'll be sure to add that link in the chat, but it helps to sort of ground what it is that we'll talk about today. In a previous webinar, we've talked about sort of one-pagers and preparing those, and it's interesting that this points out that even at that stage where it's a letter of inquiry, it's not a full proposal, it's not a full study just yet, but even at that stage, one of the key pieces that seems to be missing is how this is grounded in existing scholarship. And so that's a primary focus for our time together today. All right, why would you use literature and research? We've certainly covered it, but these 4 bullets are a nice summary. It's to ensure that the research is advancing a field. Because when you have an understanding of the advancements and developments in your field, it allows you to really make a better case for how your research is going to now advance the field from its current state. Literature, of course, provides evidence that will help substantiate your argument that you're making in whatever research document it is that you're preparing. Literature really should be the basis for all aspects of research. Again, regardless of whether you place it in the literature review section or if it's the review of literature interspersed throughout a proposal, all aspects of the research should be framed and informed by scholarly publications and research. Literature should be a common thread, really, that's interwoven throughout empirical work, proposals, dissemination efforts, not an add on at the end. And please know, those who review research on a regular basis can tell when it's sort of an add on at the end. So we'll talk more about how to ensure that that does not come across, but it's not a write the proposal, then add a literature review to match. Really, literature should be informing the work as you go. All right. We are going to look just a moment before we pivot at common mistakes to avoid. Nearly every proposal, no, maybe not every, many proposals that I know this team presenting today has seen at the National Science Foundation or even in other contexts makes this assertion that this has never been done before. And while we appreciate the passion for a particular line of research, we as program directors again, former program directors now, but when we were in those roles, could almost always find experts that had indeed done what this is before, or something incredibly similar. And so the idea here is to make sure that as you prepare literature reviews, you consider both breadth and depth. Yes, you want to cover a wide range of articles on the topic if it's available. We understand that sometimes research is exploratory, so, as broad as is possible. But you also want to add depth to that. So read deeply, ensure that the article is actually aligned with your study, go beyond those keyword searches, and make sure that you're reading deeply so that you can capture the essence of an article and again make the case for what you're proposing. Cherry picking is another common mistake to avoid where you've sort of done that just keyword search. You find a sentence that works really well, you grab that sentence, you place it in a proposal, only to later find that that one sentence really was not the essence of the paper. And you tend to discredit your own work by appearing to say that a particular author has taken a certain position, which is really opposite the position that deeper reading would have revealed. So be careful, actually, avoid. I was going to say be careful about cherry picking, but don't be careful about it. Avoid cherry picking as you move forward in preparing these kinds of documents. There are also overstatement of claims that occurs quite frequently. So you might say that something is significant when absolutely no statistical testing has been done to confirm significance. You'll want to avoid that. Or even just making broad statements without consideration of the sample size. So, you might say something had a 200% increase, but that means something very different when the sample size is 10 versus when it's 250 or 500. And so just being careful about not overstating claims as you present your data in a literature review. The last thing very quickly is not synthesizing the literature to make an argument. There are many times where many different frameworks or theoretical or conceptual frameworks might be mentioned, and it almost appears as if they're being mentioned to sort of check a box, but there is absolutely no connection between them, nor is there a connection between the theories presented and the research that is proposed or the study that is being undertaken. So, common mistakes that we definitely want you to avoid. And now, let me shift things over to Toya Frank, who is going to talk more about using literature to establish your research design.
Thank you, Tori. Um, Lit reviews are ultimately about situating yourself in conversations that are happening in your field and beyond, depending on your focus of study. So first, you want to show in lit reviews or reviews of the literature how you're building on prior research. This will be thinking about questions like what foundations you're drawing from, what kinds of key studies, theories, or findings are shaping your thinking, and asking these questions signals that your work is grounded and informed. And at the same time, strong research is driven by addressing research gaps. So you're looking for spaces where the literature is silent or perhaps incomplete, or there are contradictory views or views that are in contention with one another. You're looking for the big arguments among researchers in your field. And this is also where you're starting to think about new approaches being addressed and new framings of the phenomenon. Maybe you're trying to apply a different methodology to this particular field, or you're trying to work with a new population or ask a familiar or long-standing question in a more equitable way or from a new lens. And this is where using literature to do those things contributes to your study becoming more visible because it's looking at your question in a new way based on what you've learned from the literature. So your work should be speaking back to theory. So as you use the literature to help you develop theory, you should be asking yourself things like, how will this research refine or challenge or extend the theory that I'm working with? And this connection helps to elevate your study beyond just a single context that you're addressing. Um, And finally, just related to writing research questions informed by the literature, you want to communicate a sense of urgency for your work. You want to clearly address why this work matters now and the implications of this question going unanswered. Next slide, please. So ultimately, literature reviews do more than describe a field. As my advisor would say in college, I do not want glorified book reports about the articles that you're reading. Ultimately, they help you to make a case for your work. So once you use the literature to establish your overall research agenda or the groundwork and your questions, the next step is to use research to help you sharpen and ground your work. So a helpful way to think about this is that literature helps us get really specific about the who, what, when, where, hows, and whys. In that, it helps us define our focal area, whether your focal area is a particular experience learners are having, or a problem broader in the field that you're trying to address, or the impacts of a particular intervention. Literature is going to help us to be very clear about exactly what you're studying and how it's been studied in the past. Literature reviews also help us to clarify the contexts in which we conduct research, whether this is working in urban schools or rural settings or out of school programs. Um, the context isn't just the background for doing your research. Context really helps to shape what's possible and what matters in your area of research. It also helps to inform our activities to be studied. And depending on your field, this could be a particular experience design, some learning activity, or an intervention. So the literature will help you to understand what approaches have already been tried, what worked or didn't work in the particular phenomenon that you seek to address, and how you may be able to design something that's more responsive or effective as you learn about what's already taken place in literature. And related to that, think about like practitioner supports, because the focus of this particular presentation is STEM education and social and behavioral sciences. So many of us in these fields are asking questions like what teachers, facilitators, or leaders need in order to implement work well. And the literature can help you to highlight both the barriers and the conditions that foster support for practitioners as you design your research question and your research study more broadly. Um, we also want to be precise about the focal age of the population. Doing research with elementary students, for example, may not translate directly to high school or adult learners, and the literature can help us to narrow down excuse me, narrow down the focus of our research regarding focal age of participants. So altogether, the literature is pushing from broad ideas to helping us write well-scoped, focused, and answerable questions, questions that are grounded in what we know experientially, but they're also clearly positioned in the literature. Next slide. So, just drawing on what Tori mentioned to us before about this idea of things never being studied before in fields, sometimes this is the case. We are trying to cover new terrain in our research or taking on longstanding things in fresh and new ways, emergent ways. And so, just for a moment, we want to think about what it's like build build a new idea using existing literature. So literature can be a tool for creating and advancing new areas of study. So you notice here we have the two gentlemen trying to piece together, to bridge together existing ideas to new ones. When we're working in emergent spaces, the literature can often help us to justify why new methodologies are even needed. Sometimes existing tools don't quite fit the questions that we're asking. So researchers draw on adjacent fields to adapt and invent new approaches that may capture new kinds of data, new kinds of skills, and new types of technologies that have not been considered for the research phenomenon. And I will say recently we've seen these particular things happen in real time. So, for example, in the early late teens, early 2020s, work on AI in education required researchers to be creative when they reviewed the literature. So, pulling from fields like computer sciences and integrating the learning sciences and thinking a lot about ethics. And pulling from these different literature spaces allowed the field to ask and frame entirely new questions and new methods to address AI in education. Similarly, during the COVID-19 pandemic, researchers were rapidly shifting to online environments, whether it was teaching online or conducting research and interviews and simulations online. And the literature that emerged during that time helped us to normalize and validate approaches that were needed for a new context and hence a new body of emergent literature. So Zoom became a practical tool, and it became a tool that just wasn't out of convenience but out of necessity. And there was this new emergent research happening around these ideas. So what's important is to realize that though you're starting in a new idea, you're not necessarily starting from scratch. Again, taking on the bridge metaphor. What we're really doing is trying to weave together insights across different disciplines to identify things that transfer and then trying to name what is new in the process. So, just for those of you who are working at the edge of a new field, who are trying to design something that may be novel and emergent, making sure to use that literature to help you do two things at once. It's going to help you anchor your work in what we already know, and the literature is going to help you make a credible case for what needs to be imagined for the future. Next slide, please. So once you have grounded questions or you've thought about how research is going to help you come up with or build a bridge between what exists and your emergent idea, literature can also help shape how you study these ideas, i.e., your research design. So, literature can help you identify your theoretical foundation, which is the lens or the lenses for how you're seeing a particular problem. It can help us think through how we're going to interpret our data and make meaning of what we're learning. And literature helps to ensure that the study is ultimately conceptually anchored. So, when you're establishing a theoretical foundation for a study, we advise that sometimes one theoretical framing may not be enough. You may need to weave your theories together, and you're going to use the literature to do such. Again, putting on the former program officer hat, we think it's important to advise to not try to weave together too many theories and be very, very clear about how different theories actually work together. So, not just saying, I'm going to draw from three different theories across the study, but talking about why each of those is meaningful and how taken together they hold promise for what you intend to study. Shifting gears a little bit, but equally as connected is the methodology. So thinking about the methodology or the overall approach of your study. Really, the literature can support whether you're working within qualitative traditions, quantitative traditions, or using mixed methods. The literature can also justify why a particular approach is best suited for the questions that you're posing. So we move, and so within methodology we move next to questions, the specific tools and strategies that you'll use. So if you're working in a qualitative space, are you using interviews, and if so, what kind? Or working with using surveys or using observations or using experimental design. The literature can help you pull on prior studies, and it gives you models for what's been done and what's appropriate. The literature also informs your sample characteristic and size. So, drawing on the literature, you can look at who's been studied before and who's been left out of earlier studies, and what type of sample sizes are sufficient or typical for your type of study. And this can make sure that you have a sample that is both rigorous and inclusive. And finally, with respect to analytic plans or how you're going to make sense of the data, The literature is going to help you it's going to help share the established practices across the field, and it can help you make thoughtful choices aligned to your goals. So we've covered, and these are mostly the ways that we talked about earlier when you all took the poll of ways that you can use literature in the field, but we thought it was important to raise some other ways that literature can help enhance your work. So literature doesn't just shape your ideas, it also connects you to people. So one of the most powerful things literature can help you do is get to know the field, the researchers, and the key actors. So you'll see names start to come up as you study particular topics, and you can think about how different scholars are in dialogue with one another. Literature can also help you find collaborators. You can work with people, you can reach out to and share your ideas with those whose work resonate with you and whose questions align with yours. So ultimately, literature can help you come into a community of practice where you can connect and contribute with and to others. So literature isn't just about building knowledge, it's about building knowledge and networks. And so I am going to turn it over to Tony Danstep, who is going to talk us through some of the hows of literature reviews.
Thank you, Toya. Yeah, so transitioning into the how, let's talk about the activities involved in gathering and synthesizing literature. I'm going to go into each of these topics in more detail in just a second. But the point here is that for each of the areas Toya covered and Tori covered, theory, prior research, methodology, agendas, context, we need to gather and narrow the body of work using kind of some broad steps. And I'll just add that these are iterative. You're going back over and over through these steps. So finding literature requires that we search, iterate, and track. We need to build kind of a comprehensive list of keywords, and that the word comprehensive is important here. This involves things like brainstorming and thinking of synonyms, talking to other experts in the field, asking AI, reviewing terminology used in scholarly books or raised by scholarly societies and professional associations, and then gathering new keywords as we're reading articles. For building keywords, it really helps to start with any meta reviews or syntheses whenever possible. We need to choose multiple databases. So of course, we want to look at the databases in our field. That might be PubMed, JSTOR, PsycInfo, Web of Science, etc. But it's also a really important opportunity to expand and think outside of our silos or our status quo databases. Given how complex issues are that we're studying today, it's really just essential that we go beyond our own disciplines and contexts. And remember that funders and reviewers will bring that breadth as well. And we need to also find new pockets of literature. So this can be identifying new articles from reference lists and cited by features for articles. And it's also finding out where the gray literature is and how essential that is to the field we're working in. We never want to assume here. There is quite often some gray literature and it's harder to find, but the experts will know about it. And these keywords and databases expand really quickly, kind of exponentially. So it's essential to track this. You want to track things like database names, filters applied, keywords, eligibility criteria, the dates that you did the searching. And this is especially important since we want to perform the same searches over time to keep up with our evolving fields. That is another day, another search. And with all of these, we're looking for breadth and depth, as Tori said. And you really want to keep searching until you are not finding anything new. So ultimately, the goal here is really to be curious and be systematic. Assessing, tracking, and synthesizing is all about bringing your researcher lens and needs into this process. So once you have the articles, you want to start by screening. You want to determine if it's relevant to your research agenda, not just your specific question that you're thinking about right now. And you can do that by reading the abstract, but you also want to skim the findings and the discussion of findings to help you make that determination. If it's not relevant, you can track it and set it aside. For relevant articles, you want to do your own assessment of the researcher's theoretical grounding, methodology, data, and findings, and make notes on these. These are your critical analyses of each study. And you want to note how it connects to or contrasts with your own research question and research agenda, as well as other sources. And you want to track all of this. Could be in Excel, EndNote, Zotero, whatever system works best for you and your collaborators. And finally, you need to synthesize across all articles. And you want to use this synthesis, as Toya was saying, to inform your decisions, develop your rationale, and make a strong argument for your work. We've included a lot of resources at the end of this slide deck for you to use in thinking about these. So for many of us, our workloads are already overwhelming, and carving out time to find, read, and summarize literature can be difficult. So holding this truth alongside the essential nature of literature that Tori and Toya just described, can you, if you have any strategies that you use to help make literature reviews more efficient, we'd love it if you'd share that in the chat. And be as specific as you can be. We're all trying to build approaches and expertise here. So if there's anything you have to share, we'd appreciate it.
Our chat function is open for everybody's use.
And I might say, I'll start talking about some of the things that we've used while people, and you're welcome to keep putting in the chat if you have anything to add or if this sparks any ideas for you. So Tori, if you'll, yeah, perfect. So some of the efficiency techniques we've used include drawing on research librarians. They're really a good source for swiftly honing your search keywords and databases while ensuring that you're not being too narrow. And they're also finding ways to leverage existing activities or expectations within your existing workload. So depending on your institution and your role, you might teach a class or a section of a class on a topic, author an article or a book chapter on it. Writing really forces you. Seek grant funding for literature reviews or design it into your professional development requirements. Another way is assigning literature reviews or annotated bibliographies to graduate classes, interns, and if appropriate, undergraduates. And that in order to build both their experience and knowledge, but also your own first pass at a literature review. Another approach is distributing across collaborators. You want to be careful not to silo collaborator knowledge bases so much so that the ideas don't hang together. And there are many ways to do this. You might consider the jigsaw method, where each collaborator takes a section of a book or a subset of articles, reads, and then shares the key ideas with the rest of the group in discussion. This started as a classroom technique, but a lot of researchers are using it not only to increase efficiency, but also to develop a shared understanding. And then with all of these, you just want to keep in mind that you do need to read for yourself what you are citing and any major claims. And of course, we'll go to questions at the end. I see it and I'll get to it. Of course, AI has the potential to be a major efficiency tool. I'm guessing you're all thinking that. You want to use AI tools that are specifically designed to support academic research and each offers different efficiency gains and limitations. Our colleagues Frances Carter Johnson and James Smith did an excellent overview of specific AI tools and considerations. You can find their webinar in the Resource Hub. I'm going to just put it in the chat right now where you can find the hub. And you can, theirs is titled Ethical and Evidence-Based Use of AI Research Tools and Processes. And we highly recommend that. So AI is really great at breadth and speed, has a lot to offer. It also has a lot of limitations that can affect the usefulness of any research building on that information. Some limitations, AI can introduce misinformation and inaccuracies, misimportant studies due to bias, but also to limited databases they can search, struggle to understand and convey complexity and context, and struggle to assess or reflect the quality of studies. So as humans, we need to be validating, finding and checking all citations, expanding search spaces and databases, and again, read what we cite. It's really using AI as a complement and a thinking partner is the way to go. And that's not solely because of the limitations, but it's also to build your knowledge base and creative thinking to interact with that knowledge, because that's what's actually needed in the research enterprise. And then finally, we really need to be thinking about the ethics as we consider whether, how, and how often to use AI tools. This is an excellent interactive infographic that I just love, but we have that in the resources as well, but really it talks about and gives definitions behind each of these bars, but built-in biases that are regressive and harmful, your own data privacy, environmental damage such as water use, land use, carbon emissions, and energy consumptions. So that's the how of conducting, and Naomi is now going to talk about the how of literature reviews for proposals.
Thank you, Tony. So we have provided a lot of information on literature and reviews. And so I do want to pivot to speak to some strategies for incorporating literature into your proposals. So as Tori mentioned in the beginning, there are differences between a quote unquote literature review section versus a review of literature to ground and situate your work. And so I'm going to talk about 4 differences as we think about proposals in particular. But one thing to keep in mind is that literature for proposals, for research proposals, may be identified differently based on the funding agency. So it could just be in a background section for the National Science Foundation. You would put it in the intellectual merit section. For National Institutes of Health, it would go into a significant section. So just kind of keep that in mind. So the first difference or first strategy for identifying or for presenting your literature for proposals is purpose. So lit reviews or reviews of literature for proposals should be a little bit more narrower and more focused on the main goal of contextualizing or grounding your proposed research. Also, it should address a gap or demonstrates how the research will extend or advance existing knowledge. And this can be knowledge like so basic science, theoretical knowledge. This could be knowledge about an intervention and so forth. But it tends to be much more focused. And so then we think about the scope, which literature or reviews of literature for proposals should focus on the most relevant and recent literature related to your research question and aims. Of course, this does not mean that you cannot include groundbreaking information from decades ago. But it does mean that you need to be much more specific because broader background information can be put in sort of an introduction section if applicable. But this is really not the time to demonstrate the breadth of knowledge that you have about a particular subject if it's not really relevant to the proposed research. And as we talk about integration, so some information is embedded in an introduction, a background, or a standalone section. However, the review of literature for proposals really should be linked throughout the proposal. So the literature should be linked through to your research problem or research aims. It should be linked to your decision of what methodology or approach sections. And so as the reviewer and or the funder, you should be able to see the connection with the literature throughout the proposal. And as I'm speaking about, as a funder, the audience is different, right? So you must be able to convey or convince funders, I should say, and depending on what you're applying for, it could be reviewers, but You need to convince them of the importance, the feasibility, and the novelty of your proposed work and why they should invest in it. One of the things that I think is important is you can really think of the review of literature for proposals as telling a story. So if you have listened or read bad stories, you know that there is an art to telling a good, compelling story. And so a good story can evoke a range of emotions and it can inspire someone. So this is also true for writing a good, compelling proposal. You want the audience to feel something that leads them to open their wallets for you. In terms of successful literature reviews, as for former program officers for the National Science Foundation, we have, of course, read tons of literature reviews. The most successful ones drive the argument and support the methods. The funder or the reviewer does not have to go on like a fishing expedition, right, to figure out how your literature review or how the literature connects to the research questions and to the methods. Successful literature reviews clarify your rationale and help the reader to easily see how your choices in questions, design, and methodology are justified. And in the specific case of grant proposals, the question you should always try to answer is, does my literature section or review of literature do enough to convince the funder that this proposed project is going to advance knowledge and understanding within the field and or across other disciplines? A funder is always going to be thinking about the return on investment. So keep in mind, a great literature section or review is not about length, it's about saturation. Often the amount of space afforded to researchers and grant proposals is minimal. So you must make sure that you are focused and only including the most relevant and compelling information that supports your work. So I have the wonderful job of summarizing what we have talked about today. So as we're coming to the end of our presentation, I do want to provide a quick summary of what we have already talked about because I know it's a lot of information. So the top green boxes corresponds to the why of literature reviews, and the blue boxes are going to correspond to the how. So we know that literature grounds your work. It should be the foundation for all aspects of the research. It demonstrates that you understand the advancements and the developments in the field and provides evidence that helps to substantiate your argument. As Tori noted, it may be called literature, a literature synthesis, or literature review. Either way, it should be framed and informed by timely and relevant scholarly information. As Tori also provided some common mistakes to avoid. And again, as former program officers, we have seen these mistakes often and try to really encourage you to avoid them. Things like cherry picking, overstating claims, and stating this has never been done before may be more problematic than helpful for your cause. Toya talked about how to use the literature to guide your research agenda and questions. And so this is the opportunity to talk about how you are building on prior research, what theoretical or conceptual foundations you're using, where are the gaps, how will your research refine, challenge, or extend what we already know? So the literature, in essence, helps to answer the who, what, when, how, and why questions. Tony gave us a lot of information on the how, right? She talked about activities involved in gathering and synthesizing literature. She provided some great strategies for building your list of keywords to search, choosing databases. And one of the most important strategies, in my opinion, is to make sure that you're looking for studies and literature outside of your discipline. She talked about being systematic and tracking what and where you search. So the importance of assessing what you read, tracking the information you pull from scholarly sources, and then being able to synthesize across all of these sources to really help to inform your decisions and provide support for your work. Finally, there were some efficiency techniques, such as utilizing, reference librarians, your collaborators, your interns, your students, and of course, technology such as AI. Keeping in mind not only the strengths of using AI, but also being mindful of potential limitations and ethical issues surrounding its use, particularly in scholarly endeavors. And so I talked about using literature and proposal writing specifically. So keeping in mind that review of literature for proposals often are more narrow and more focused. You need to be really clear about your scope, the integration throughout, and the connection to your methodology is really important. And finally, so literature reviews for funding proposals is often looked at as telling a compelling story to the funder and encouraging them to invest in your research. And I'll say this again, keep asking yourself, does your literature review or your review of literature do enough to convince the funder that your proposed research would advance the field? Because the funder needs to anticipate a positive return on investment. And because we are short on time, I'll just say, as Tony mentioned earlier, we have some resources for you. So once this webinar is over and you access the QEM Resource Hub, which I'll tell you how to do in a moment, and download the webinar, you will be able to simply click on the links provided. And you see there are 3 categories of links. And so I'll let you take a look at that after the webinar is over. So we'll advance to the calendar. And so as we wrap up the webinar, we did want to provide you with information on the upcoming webinars in the Capacity Building for Applied STEM Education and Behavioral Sciences Research Series. The 4 of us are the facilitators and the presenters for the series. I like to call us 3T and me. And so we will talk I don't really have time to talk about each one of the sessions, but you can see the names of those. We will cover mixed methodology. We'll cover a plethora of wonderful topics. Also, this information will be posted on the HEROES webpage and a similar graphic distributed across various social media platforms by the QEM network. And so we would want to end by saying thank you for your time and your attention today. We have listed all of our email addresses along with our areas of expertise. Please feel free to reach out with any questions or concerns. We're all very happy to assist. I mentioned, please check out our upcoming webinars as well as the upcoming webinars from the other HEROES Fellows by visiting the QEM events page. You'll see the QR code there. And also, if you visit the HEROES webpage, you see the QR code. You'll see information about all of the fellows, their expertise and geographic area that they cover. So please don't hesitate to contact any of the fellows, and we all have office hours to talk to you. Finally, we have a feedback form that we would love for you to complete. Let us know your thoughts about this particular webinar, any topics you would love to see covered, and any other general or specific feedback you have for us. So I believe we have a little bit of time for questions and discussion.
We have multiple tools available for question and discussion. You can use the Q&A box, you can use the chat, or you can raise your hand to come off mute.
Don't forget the questions that have already been placed in chat from earlier, please.
So I answered Adrian's question about how you can involve undergraduates in lit reviews, but others of you have taught undergraduates more recently than I have. So I wonder if you have ideas to add to what I put in the chat.
When I read your response, Tony, I thought it was excellent. It was definitely what I was going to say. The only thing that I would add that might be a touch more specific was with undergraduate students, I find it great to start with a single article. Tony, you mentioned being more focused. I think teaching the methods and the strategies on a single writing or a single reading is much better approach. And then, depending on the students, how many there are, how much time you have, you can certainly expand from there.
Yeah, and I just want to add, so 16 years, all undergrads, and I used to teach research methods and statistics in psychological sciences. And one of the best activities that I've had, had with the students was to put them in small groups. So maybe it's 3 students. Each does their own article. So, you give them a guideline of how to review an article. And then You give them some time and they get together and they now have to come up with how the three articles are alike, how they're dissimilar, how they, so there's an activity around comparing and contrasting. And so I agree with Tori in terms of giving them one article first, but then also putting them in a setting where they can have a discussion and they can kind of go back and forth and they can learn how to compare and contrast. And now they have to write up a review of those, a lit review of those three articles together.
Yeah, I think that's a great exercise to help them, one, think about. I don't teach research to undergraduates, but even working with new graduate students, like the anatomy of research articles. They may be doing different things, but we tend to follow a flow in the way that we do that. So helping students to learn how to look across articles and pull out those important pieces. And Naomi, I think you bring up this idea of synthesis across articles. Having them do it as a team is really important. So I would think if I were working with undergrads, helping them how to synthesize early, I think is a great skill to have.
One thing I'll point out, Carrie Hall put in the chat about getting lost down the rabbit hole of literature review work. And I do think it reiterates a point that we attempted to make around depth and deep reading. So absolutely, it's okay to get lost kind of down that rabbit hole, because it's in the deep reading that really the best information, the most rich information comes forward. Just ensure that it's not breadth or depth. You want to cover a range of existing research articles while also being able to read deeply. All right, I think that's everything that was in the chat. Let's see.
There's
Is there
a
something?
Q&A question.
Yeah, there's a
Naomi,
Q&A
you want to
question.
do it?
No. No, I will. I will. Tony. I'll read it. So Greg says, I often find that reading an academic paper is a time-consuming and tiring process because it takes a lot of effort to go through the arguments and equations. Do you have different ways to read papers so that you can get through them faster? Any advice for how to decide which papers need what level of understanding and how to get through a paper quickly, but still in a useful way?
Oh, go ahead, Toy.
Oh, no. Well, I was just going to say it goes back to talking about working with early grad students, talking about the anatomy of a research article. So helping them to think about what they're going to glean from each section. I think that's one way to start with them to really think about, across topics. I feel comfortable enough at this point in my career to say, like, most research articles are going to follow a particular structure, and based on what you're using the article for, whether it's really thinking about your methods section or whether it's thinking about how the topic itself like helps to inform what you intend to study. I think that's a starting point for thinking about how to read it. And I'd also say I think reading them efficiently is important. I don't always know quickly. Sometimes, especially when you're new at it, I just think it's time consuming. And I think it's worth building that time up front to build the muscles so that then students can say, okay, I know what the structure of these things is like. Let me go for what I need, then maybe go back and address some of the other things. But yeah, just thinking about efficiency, especially in graduate school, reading hundreds of pages a week, you do need a strategy for how to do it. So I think this was a really awesome question.
I think even as research, oh, sorry, Tori, were you going
No. Go ahead.
even as researchers, it's building that muscle and then rebuilding that muscle is really helpful, right? Like we go in and out of how often we're deep in the literature. For me, a lot of it is like a shift in the idea of like it not being a drudge, but it being a joy to find and understand and learn about how people are doing it. So thinking of it as kind of each piece is an inspiration for you to get into what you want to do next and how important it is and what's really going to drive a field. So that's just in addition to what Toya said.
And I'll say quickly, I know we're out of time, but I see what David put in the chat. And I was going to be incredibly transparent, yet make a really strong point that there should be no shortcuts, as Toya and Tony have noted. But I will say that I am very disappointed when I read an entire paper because a title made me think I was going to get something, and then it's underwhelming at best. So I did start to read discussion sections first. So, kind of, what did they get from this? Kind of start right after the analysis to see if it's what I thought it was. Then, based on that, I can go back and read deeply, because sometimes I can read that analysis section or the discussion that follows the analysis and figure out whether this is what I thought it would be or not. So, I will say that as a personal strategy that does not replace reading an entire article, but I do sort of read maybe the end first and then go back to the beginning, because it gives a better idea of what to expect.
And you want to know if it's worth your time for the investment, right? So I think having a strategy, that's a viable strategy to decide if it's worth giving it lots of time and attention, because not every article will be worth your time when you're reviewing literature.
Well, I'm going to say the dirty word, AI. AI can, and this may not be for new students or people you're trying to train, but you can use AI to summarize articles, and you give it very explicit instructions on what you're asking it to look for. And then based on what it spits out, then you decide whether or not to read the entire article. So that's another, it's not a replacement for reading the article, but it is a way to cut down on the hundreds of papers that may be relevant or not to what you're doing. And then you go back and read the ones that are viable to what you're doing.
Great point.
Well, we are 2 minutes past time, and I just want to say thank you so much for attending the Heroes Fellows webinar series. We hope to see you at a future webinar soon. Thanks to our presenters for an engaging and in-depth discussion today. We'll see you soon.